They said he wasn't really blind, just old, slow, and stubborn. That's what the young guard laughed, just seconds before it happened, while a woman behind the front desk shook her head and muttered, "Another wannabe hero looking for attention." But he didn't argue, didn't even lift his voice. He simply reached for the folder in his coat and took one careful step forward, right before they shoved him. And when his cane hit the stairs instead of the marble floor, the silence that followed was louder than any siren. Later, when they opened the folder lying beside him, they found something no one expected. A side letter from a NATO commander, a photograph of men in combat gear surrounding a younger version of the man now lying still on the tile, and a clearance stamp that hadn't been valid for 20 years because it never expired. If you believe no one who served should be treated like garbage, and that honor doesn't come with age limits, then like and subscribe. Because silence let this happen, and silence is how it keeps happening. He didn't look like much when he first walked in, bent back, creased face, dark glasses hiding the eyes that had once scanned rooftops for snipers, now blinded by an explosion in '89 that had taken half his vision and none of his memory. His name was Robert Langley, though no one asked. He wore a plain black coat, one button missing near the collar, and walked with a white cane that tapped lightly against the polished floor of the Federal Appeals Building on Vermont Avenue, D.C. The guards barely looked up. One muttered to the other, another lost case with a folder full of complaints. But Robert wasn't there for himself. He was carrying an envelope, thick and creased, labeled, "For Director, Urgent, 2007 Injured Vet Appeal." He had traveled 2 states by bus to hand-deliver it because the man it concerned couldn't walk anymore. And Robert, well, Robert hadn't quit walking when he lost his sight, and he wasn't about to start now. The front desk didn't recognize the name on the letter. A new guard named Dixon, barely out of private security school, sized Robert up like a nuisance. "Sorry, old man, no walkins," he said, stretching the words as if he were talking to a child. Robert tilted his head slightly. "I have a 9:15 appointment with ADA Johnston. She confirmed yesterday." "And I said no walkins," Dixon repeated, stepping forward. Robert didn't flinch. He reached into his coat to retrieve the paper. That's when Dixon reached too quickly, unnecessarily, and with the flick of an arm meant more to intimidate than defend, pushed Robert's hand away. The folder fell. The cane followed. And Robert, blind and unsuspecting, took one step forward, his foot finding on the air. He fell hard. Not dramatic, not loud, just real. One hand tried to brace. The other was still reaching for a folder that no one had picked up. His back hit first, then his shoulder, then his head. Gasps rippled through the lobby, and for a long second, no one moved. Not the receptionist. Not the security. Not the people waiting in line who suddenly found the floor tiles fascinating. "Sir, you need to calm down," Dixon barked, even though Robert hadn't spoken. From the far corner, a woman in scrubs stood. "He's blind. What the hell is wrong with you?" she said, running toward him. "I'm a nurse. Someone call 911. Dixon raised a hand. "Ma'am, please stay back." She ignored him, knelt beside Robert, who was now slowly trying to sit up, one hand feeling along the cold marble. "You okay, sir?" she asked gently. Robert didn't answer. Not because he couldn't, but because he was focused on something else. The folder. "My envelope," he whispered. The nurse reached for it, opening the seal that had begun to tear during the fall. Her face changed as she pulled out the contents. "Oh my God," she said under her breath. Inside, a clearance badge with an old Pentagon seal. A black and white photo of soldiers crouched under smoke, one man, Robert, circled in red. And a cover letter with words at the top that stopped her breath, "Classified Historical Recovery Request, from the desk of Commander S.T. Maynor, NATO Allied Forces." She looked up. "This isn't a complaint. This is," she turned to Dixon. "You don't know what you just did." But Robert did. He already had. Because while the lobby spun into chaos, security radios clicking on, a bystander shouting about uploading video, and someone calling for a supervisor, Robert was already dialing. Not 911. Not his daughter. Just one number burned into memory. No screen reader. No voice prompt. He held the phone to his ear. When it picked up, he spoke calmly, the way you do when you've lived through worse. "It happened," he said. "Send the file." He hung up, then leaned back against the base of the stairs, still sitting where he'd fallen. Dixon stood over him, mouth opening to apologize, but Robert cut him off without raising his voice. "You didn't just push a man. You pushed something you weren't trained to recognize." And for the first time that morning, Dixon didn't have anything to say. Not because he finally understood, but because something outside was changing. A black SUV had just pulled up, 2 stars on the license plate. Inside, someone who knew exactly who Robert Langley was already stepping out, and he wasn't smiling. Robert Langley hadn't moved from the floor, not because he couldn't, but because he knew he didn't have to. He'd been still before, long ago, in darker places where silence wasn't weakness, it was survival. The nurse stayed kneeling next to him, still holding the half-crumpled letter in her hand, her eyes flicking between the words and the entrance. "Who are you?" she whispered, but Robert didn't answer. He just listened. Listened to the building react the way bureaucracies do when something doesn't fit their process. Phones ringing faster now. Radios hissing with static as a higher-up was called. Dixon, the guard who had pushed him, shifted from rigid posture to nervous pacing. He tried to reassert control, first with protocol, then apology, but now the cracks were showing. And then the doors opened. Not the regular revolving glass doors, but the emergency side entrance. It swung wide, held there by a woman in uniform so sharp she looked carved from granite. Lieutenant Colonel Ava Sheridan. Her boots hit the marble with precision, each step unhurried but undeniable. She didn't scan the lobby. She didn't ask directions. She walked like someone who already knew the room and who to address. "Where's Robert Langley?" she said, flatly. Dixon stepped forward, hesitating. "Ma'am, he had no valid appointment. He was being difficult. We didn't know who. I wasn't talking to you," she snapped, eyes never leaving Robert. Ava crouched beside him, dropped to one knee, not in submission, but in deference. She didn't speak at first, just rested a hand lightly on his shoulder. "You called," she said simply. Robert nodded. It was time. She rose, turned toward the gathering cluster of staff, lobby visitors, and now 2 supervisors trying to look like they'd been involved the whole time. This man trained NATO's psychological operations response teams in 3 continents. He wrote the post-conflict de-escalation protocols your instructors cribbed in Security 101. She raised her voice. And today, he was shoved down a federal staircase like a trespasser. The crowd hushed. Dixon's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth to respond, but didn't. Ava continued, pulling a worn leather folder from her satchel. For those needing documentation, she flipped it open. Inside, a photo, a much younger Langley in desert gear, one hand gripping the radio, the other pointing over a ridge. Behind him, a group of men with faces blurred out and one NATO flag fluttering at half-mast. The badge tucked into the front read, Special Operations Legacy, Contingency Protocol C4, Unlimited Honor Access. "This doesn't expire," she added, "because his service never did." Whispers now. The receptionist leaned toward her colleague, who was pulling up Robert's name in the visitor system, only to find a blinking override code. Red level guest. Escort required. Ava lifted her radio. "Send the escort team." Within seconds, the same black SUV that had pulled up outside discharged 3 uniformed officers, who entered the building not with weapons drawn, but with dress blues and straight spines. "Escort arriving," Ava said. "Take him to the medical wing," discreetly. "Then notify the building director. And get me the OG liaison on the line." Still, Robert said nothing. He let them help him up. But as the 2 officers gently guided him toward the side corridor, he paused. Turned just enough for Dixon to hear him. "I didn't fall," he said, voice soft but steady. "You fell." Dixon blinked. "What?" "You fell short," Robert said, "of what you were supposed to be." And with that, he was gone, ushered through a doorway that hadn't been opened for anyone in years. News didn't break in tweets or headlines, not yet. But something spread faster. Every agent, officer, and administrator in that building began whispering the same name, Robert Langley. He had once debriefed insurgents in silence until they broke. He had taught resilience without needing rank to speak for him. And today, without raising a hand or a voice, he had reminded them what real command looked like. Upstairs, the director of Veteran Services pulled the sealed envelope from the nurse's hand and reread it 3 times, then called a Pentagon liaison and said 4 words, "You need to see this." Meanwhile, in a small corner of the building lobby, someone had left a phone recording running. It captured the fall. The radio chatter. Ava Sheridan's arrival. It was already being shared internally, and some said a major news outlet had been ticked off. But Robert Langley didn't care. He sat quietly in the medical wing, coat folded over his lap, as a young medic took his vitals with trembling hands. "Sir," the medic said softly, "my brother, he was one of yours. You saved his unit outside Kandahar. He always said there was a guy who didn't blink when the world did." Robert smiled faintly. "He's doing all right. He named his son after you," the medic replied. And outside the medical bay, the building's director of operations was deleting surveillance footage, until Ava stepped in and said, "I wouldn't. That file just got archived under military review." Silence followed. But not the same kind that came before. Because now every step in that building, every whisper in the hallway, every memo sent or filed or signed carried one clear echo: the blind man wasn't just a veteran. He was a legacy in plain sight, and someone had just tripped over him, not knowing they'd fall all the way up. They called it a private review meeting, but nothing about it felt small, not the lineup of suits in the observation gallery, not the armed military escort standing quietly in the back. And definitely not the fact that Robert Langley sat dead center at the front of the room, sunglasses on, coat folded neatly beside him, and the envelope they tried to dismiss just days earlier sitting unopened on the director's podium. He hadn't asked to be there. He hadn't asked for apologies, for headlines, or even justice. He'd asked one thing only: read the letter out loud. The one that was ignored when I handed it over. Across the room, the man who had pushed him, the guard who now sat without a badge, in plain clothes, fidgeted with a folded tissue in his hand, eyes downcast. Cameras were off. This wasn't for public show. This was about reckoning. The director cleared his throat, unfolded the thick paper with fingers that shook just slightly, and began to read. It was dated July 12, 2006. Signed by Commander Samuel T. Maynor, NATO Allied Command Operations. In it, Robert Langley was referred to as the cornerstone architect of civilian risk extraction logistics, whose post-active duty work prevented at least 4 recorded international escalations. It described Robert's covert re-entry into Kabul during the embassy crisis. His blind interrogation techniques, because, as the letter said, he could read tone better than most could read faces. The room was frozen. The same man security had labeled a confused walk-in had once been on call for silent contingency leadership when the usual systems failed. The nurse who had helped him off the floor sat quietly in the second row. She hadn't taken a day off since. Ava Sheridan stood at the rear, arms folded, face unreadable but posture proud. When the director reached the last lines of the letter, his voice cracked. "Though Mr. Langley is no longer an active operator, his clearance remains valid indefinitely. Let no desk or door forget the weight of what he carried so others didn't have to." Robert nodded once. He didn't stand. He didn't need to. His presence stood for him. "Why didn't you say who you were?" one of the internal board members finally asked. Robert turned his head just slightly. "Because I never stopped being who I was. You just stopped asking who people are." The words didn't sting like a slap. They sunk like a truth finally finding its echo. The dismissed security guard stood up suddenly, hands clenched at his side. "Mr. Langley, I was—" Robert held up a hand. Not harshly. Just firmly. "What you did to me was wrong. But what you do next is what matters. Get trained. Learn who walks through those doors. You don't need rank to show respect." The man nodded. Then sat back down, smaller than he'd been days ago, not because he'd been scolded, but because he'd been seen. And knowing someone had seen your failure with dignity was far heavier than a suspension letter ever could be. After the meeting, no press releases were issued. But changes happened anyway. A new protocol was installed, one that scanned for legacy clearance files even if IDs didn't match modern formatting. Internal security footage was flagged for external review in all cases involving physical altercations with veterans. And a small plaque appeared near the east entrance, right by the very steps where Robert Langley had fallen. It didn't say much. Just a quote: "When a system forgets to ask who you were, you remind them by how you stand." Days later, Robert visited the building again, but not as a visitor. He had been quietly offered the title of Senior Honorary Advisor on Veteran Experience and Access. He declined the office, accepted the title, and every Tuesday morning, a folding chair appeared in the lobby, where Robert sat with his cane beside him, answering questions no one thought to ask. "Do you know what it feels like when no one believes you matter anymore?" he'd ask. "Feels a lot like marble under your shoulder blades." And people listened. Security guards, interns, civilian visitors. Sometimes they just passed him by. But now, they paused. They looked again. Because even when a man can no longer see the world, sometimes he sees right through it. The nurse visited often. The medic who treated him sent a photo of Robert's framed letter hanging in his brother's home. And Ava Sheridan? She promoted the nurse to Federal Care Coordinator after finding out she stayed with Robert hours past her shift. As for the fall, that moment that sparked it all, it was never broadcast, never posted. Not because it wasn't powerful, but because Robert asked it not to be. People remember impact more than pain, he said. Show them what came after. That's the real story. And the building listened. At the end of the fiscal year, they renamed the incident report category from disruption, lobby escalation to critical missed recognition. That one change filtered to every VA facility in the region. And once a year, every staff member in that building, regardless of rank, received a sealed envelope. Inside, a scanned photo of Robert Langley in full combat gear, a NATO-issued commendation, and 5 words printed on the back. What you see isn't always who stands before you. Robert never asked for recognition. He only asked they never forget the cost of failing to see someone. Because the real fall wasn't when he hit the stairs. It was when they assumed he couldn't stand tall anymore. But he did. And now, so did they.